He is an eminent scholar of American history whose publications are much too numerous to mention, only two of which I will indicate here, From the Age of Roosevelt and The Cycles of American History being two classics. He was also a special advisor to President Kennedy in the 1960s, and it was his influence, as I understand, was instrumental in initiating the dialogue that eventually resulted in the Kennedy administration's affirmation of the center-left. He also had a unique connection with Salvemini, which I will allow him to describe himself. Professor Schlesinger.
I find it entirely felicitous that this part of the session should be preceded by the commentary on Gaetano Salvemini, for it is to that grand old patriot that I owe my long-standing concern with the fate and future of Italian democracy. The ascent to power of Mussolini produced mixed reactions in the United States in the 1920s. Conservatives, business leaders admired Il Duce for allegedly bringing order and discipline to an unruly people, and they regarded anti-fascist Italians as troublemakers and radicals. Liberals condemned Mussolini as a dictator and tyrant and sought to help the anti-fascists. This was my father's view, and in 1929, as chairman of the Harvard History Department, and with the departments and the dean's backing, he sent a cable to Salvemini, then in exile in London, inviting him to teach for a semester in Cambridge as a visiting professor. After the invitation went out, and before Salvemini answered, the president of Harvard, A. Lawrence Lowell, notified my father that an influential member of the corporation, Harvard's governing body, strongly objected to the invitation, and that the invitation must be retracted while time still permitted. My father replied that since the department had acted with proper authorization, the offer could not in honor be withdrawn. As my father wrote later in his memoirs, Lowell may himself have had doubts about the proceeding. In any event, he did not pursue the matter further. Salvemini, a man of passion, wit, and unconquerable zest for life, captivated Cambridge, and after James B. Conant became president in 1933, the history department, through the means that Spencer the Scala recalled for us, the history department secured him on a regular basis. Salvemini was a familiar figure in our household when I was growing up. George LaPiana was another friend of my father's, and the passion he and Salvemini shared for a democratic Italy was infectious. Other anti-fascist Italian exiles passed through our house, and when war came, I followed events in Italy with particular interest while working for the Office of War Information in Washington and later for the Office of Strategic Services in Paris. By an odd coincidence, I rented a room in the winter of 1944, in the last months of the war, in the Paris apartment of Salvemini's second wife, from whom he had long parted, and who was, by even odder coincidence, the mother of Jean Leclerc, the notorious French collaborationist who was shot after the war. When I returned to Cambridge after the war, Salvemini, then in his 70s, was as vivid and vital as ever. I remember a wonderful evening when he dined at our house with Arthur Koestler, and the two survivors discussed in sardonic fashion the comparative merits of internment by Mussolini and by Franco. After he went back to Salvemini went back to Italy, I called on him in Sorrento. He fell sick in the summer of 1957 and died in September. I found in my father's papers Salvemini's last words, as taken down by his friend Roberto Bolafio. "To die smilingly," the old professor said, "that is what I should like. I could not have foreseen a more serene death than this." He drifted off to sleep, then awakening a moment before he died, he said characteristically, "I am not dead yet." Well, the spirit of Salvemini is, I trust, not dead in Italy, nor is his dream of an honest, progressive, democratic nation, and I can well imagine what would have been the pungency of his reaction to the corruption of that dream in recent years. As one in deep sympathy with that dream, and ever hopeful, I have anxiously followed the fortunes of Italian democracy. In this effort, I must express gratitude to another Italian friend, this time of my own generation, Tullio Zevi, whom I first met in Paris in 1939 and saw much of when she and her husband, Bruno Zevi, came to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1940. In later years, when I visited Rome, Tullio Zevi would often arrange meetings with leading politicians and journalists. It was at her salon that I first talked with Pietro Nenni and Giuseppe Saragat, and I owe much to her charm, wisdom, and generosity. I go into all this to explain why a historian of the United States who reads Italian with great difficulty and speaks it not at all, why I should have become involved in U.S.-Italian relations during the presidency of John Kennedy. Italy in the immediate post-war years seemed one of the more vulnerable nations in the democratic world. An indisputably democratic country, Italy still had the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union and the most intelligent communist leadership anywhere. It also had a socialist party that was rich in tradition, but under Nenni's leadership appeared to have aligned itself irrevocably with the Soviet side in the global civil war. Given the disquietudes that affected even Western Europe in the late 1940s, could one be sure that Italy would stay within the democratic camp? I followed the Italian situation in those years with keen interest, applauding the Partito d'Azione in 1945, cheering Saragat on when he led the pro-democratic socialists out of the PSI in 1947 to form the Social Democratic Party, approving, too, when the CIA intervened in the 1948 election to prevent a communist victory, noting with disapproval Nenni's continuing attacks on NATO and American imperialism. The attacks in 1951 won him the Stalin Peace Prize. But a curious episode in September 1950 persuaded me that the situation might be more ambiguous than it appeared. One day in London, that brilliant and iconoclastic Labor Party gadfly, Richard H.S. Crossman, editor of that famous exposure of communism, The God That Failed, Crossman invited me to dinner at the House of Commons. Among the other guests were Arthur Koestler, Raymond Aron, John Strachey, and assorted wives. Much drink was served, and after dinner the conversation became heated. Dick Crossman, who had just returned from Italy, argued that the Labor Party should resume fraternal relations with the PSI. This roused Arthur Koestler to indignation that soon turned to fury. Nenni, he said, had sold out irrevocably to Stalin. Labor would fatally compromise itself if it tried to do business with him. Crossman responded with equal asperity. Finally, Koestler arose, summoned his lovely wife, and said, "This is unforgivable. Come on, Mamaine, we're leaving." Raymond Aron and I followed the Koestlers out into the corridor, begging Arthur to relax and not break his old friendship with Crossman. But he angrily declined and strode out into the night, a gesture somewhat marred by the fact that the Koestlers were planning to stay that night with the Crossmans in their house in Vincent Square. Mamaine Koestler, however, solved that problem by phoning for a room in Grosvenor House. Crossman, of course, turned out in the end to be right. In 1952, Nenni began to favor independent PSI electoral slates, and in the spring of 1953, he indicated to the journalist Leo Wallenberg, from whose discerning and exceptionally well-informed dispatches I learned much in these years, suggested to Wallenberg that he was drawing away from the PCI. After the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956, Nenni returned the Stalin Peace Prize and gave the prize money to Hungarian refugees. By the late 1950s, many observers were beginning to feel that a socialist breakaway from the Communist alliance was possible. American embassy in Rome did not, however, believe it. Ambassador Clare Booth Luce, an intractable, if charming, anti-leftist, laid down a hard line against the PSI and refused to let embassy staff meet with PSI leaders. When speculation arose about a reunion between Nenni and Saragat, and even about PSI entry into the government, the Eisenhower administration made clear its profound opposition to any opening to the left. It did not trust Nenni, believing him to be at best a neutralist, at worst a Stalinist dupe or agent. In effect, the Eisenhower administration imposed an American veto on a center-left government in Italy. Mrs. Luce left in '57, but her successor, James D. Zellerbach, while more easygoing in his attitudes, maintained the veto. Some American officials disagreed. The Apertura Sinistra, they thought, would both isolate the communists and move the Italian government toward necessary and beneficial reforms, thereby undermining the basis of the communist appeal. The debate over the opening to the left began in the Rome embassy, and we are lucky to have with us here today a hero of this struggle, George Lister, who came to Rome in late 1957 as the first secretary. Lister's prior experience in Eastern Europe had instructed him in the vast differences between the democratic left and the totalitarian left. He now proposed that he be permitted to talk to socialists, and with Zellerbach's approval, Lister developed a widening circle of contacts. He was soon reporting encouraging evidence of socialist responsiveness to this dialogue. However, as I have described in 1,000 Days, the arrival of a new deputy chief of mission in '59 brought about a reversion to the loose, hard line. The new man held exceedingly conservative views. He feared a center-left coalition as, in his words, a dangerous trap that would lead to the neutralization of Italy. The thing to do with the socialists, he thought, was to drive them back into the arms of the communists. Of course, this is exactly what Moscow would have wanted. The DCM exerted severe pressure on Lister to desist from his efforts with the socialists, but Lister continued the meetings, and once, when the DCM was on vacation, carried his case with his immediate superior's approval to Ambassador Zellerbach. January 1961, Kennedy became president. I joined the administration as one of his special assistants. Interest in Italian affairs was hardly high in the White House, but I soon learned that a member of McGeorge Bundy's National Security Council staff, Robert Comer, was also advocating a change in our policy toward the Apertura. Comer, who had come to the White House from the CIA, was a very bright man, a witty memorandum writer, and a relentless goad to action. He later went on to a distinguished career as ambassador to Turkey and Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He and I became allies at once in the determination to lift the Eisenhower veto on the PSI. A visit to Italy in April '61 confirmed my sense that the time was overdue for a change in policy. As Comer and I were discovering each other in Washington, Averell Harriman, Kennedy's newly appointed roving ambassador, paid a visit to Rome. George Lister, who served as his interpreter in some of his meetings with political leaders, warned Harriman of the embassy's hang-up about the PSI and the embassy's unrelenting opposition to the center-left movement. Harriman, whose political instincts were generally unerring, except when it came to his native state of New York, got the Italian situation at once, and on his return to Washington, pronounced Lister the only officer in the Rome embassy who understood the communist problem. A lot of good this did Lister, however, for on his rotation back from Rome, where he received the department's top rating for his job performance, he was informed that the annual promotion panel had recommended him for selection out of the Foreign Service. As I related in 1,000 Days, Harriman rescued Lister and enabled him to continue to play a key role in changing U.S.-Italian policy in the department, though at considerable cost to his personal career. Recent years, George Lister has made notable contributions to the development and institutionalization of human rights as a major theme in American foreign policy and as a permanent bureau in the Department of State. Indeed, the Chilean government recently invited him to Chile as an honored guest in recognition of his work on behalf of human rights and democracies. As for the DCM, he was rewarded for being wrong by promotion and an assignment as ambassador. As one who has worked on a multitude of occasions with professional diplomats from my first government job in the OWI more than half a century ago, I hold the American Career Foreign Service in the highest respect. But the department Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower hardly represented professional diplomacy at its best. Under John Foster Dulles and his conception of positive loyalty, as he called it, the department had been effectively disciplined and purged. Independent and liberal spirits had a rough time in those Dulles years. The time servers and reactionaries who prospered under Dulles regarded the incoming Kennedy administration as a collection of meddling and soft-headed amateurs. I knew nothing of it at the time, and it is hard to believe even now, but the researches of Alan Platt and Spencer de Scala reveal that in November '61, some officers in the Rome embassy, led, according to Italian sources, by Vernon Walters, the military attaché and a man of extreme right-wing views, later Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations and George Bush's to West Germany, actually recommended U.S. military intervention, if necessary, to stop a center-left government. So harebrained an idea would never have got far in the Kennedy administration, but the mere discussion shows the intensity of official resistance. There is no doubt that Italian opponents of the apertura, which included at the time such wily politicians as Giulio Andreotti, eagerly cultivated allies in the U.S. Embassy. In Washington, despite Averell Harriman's visit to Rome, the department continued to insist on the Eisenhower veto and to oppose any Italian government dependent even on outside support by the PSI. The argument was now that lifting the veto would constitute impermissible intervention in internal Italian politics, a most peculiar argument since it was the veto itself that constituted the intervention, and lifting it would leave the Italians free to make their own decisions and permit Italian politics to take its natural course. The new U.S. ambassador to Rome, G. Frederick Reinhardt, was an urbane and likable man who continued, though with much less conviction than the previous DCM, to oppose the apertura. Reinhardt had amiable relations with the moderate Italian right, and while he supposed that the center-left development was inevitable at some point, he wondered what the great hurry was. In the meantime, he complained to Kennedy, and later in his oral history memoirs in this library, about my meddling in Italian affairs. Of course, before getting involved at all, I had talked to Kennedy, as Bob Comer had talked to Bundy. Both the President and the Special Assistant for National Security agreed with us that it was time for the veto on the PSI to go. Prime Minister Fanfani's visit to Washington in June '61 provided an opportunity to signal the change in policy. The apertura was not on the State Department's agenda for the talks, but Kennedy told Fanfani privately that if the Italian Prime Minister thought the center-left a good idea, we would watch developments with sympathy. That should have ended the matter, but it did not. There is no clear change of line inside the department. Why did not Kennedy and Bundy simply order a reversal of policy? To answer this question, one must appreciate the murkiness of bureaucratic politics. Both men were preoccupied with questions of far greater urgency. 1961, after all, was the year of the Bay of Pigs, the trouble in Laos, the Kennedy-Khrushchev meeting, the Berlin crisis, the resumption of nuclear testing, and so on. Both Kennedy and Bundy were having arguments with the department on fronts they considered a good deal more consequential than Italy. In effect, they gave Schlesinger and Comer hunting licenses, but did not choose to expend their own ammunition on so low priority an issue. I should add that Kennedy never at any point told me to stop doing what he well knew I was doing on the Italian front. Comer and I had allies inside and outside the government. In the State Department, not only Harriman, but George Ball, the Undersecretary, Roger Hilsman, the Chief of Intelligence and Research, Bill Tyler, the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, and Richard Gardner, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs, and later a fine ambassador to Italy, were all with us. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, Arthur Goldberg, the influential Secretary of Labor, and the wing of the AFL-CIO led by Walter and Victor Reuther of the United Auto Workers were all on our side. Still, with the top officials otherwise engaged, the anti-apertura officers who commanded the direct line of action were able to conduct a dogged rearguard fight. I speculated on their motives in 1,000 Days, from which I quote, "It was partly, I imagine, the chronic difficulty of changing established policies, partly the patriotic conviction on the part of certain Foreign Service officers that they owned American foreign policy and in any case knew better than the White House what it should be, partly an innate Foreign Service preference for conservatives over progressives, along with a traditional weakness for the Roman aristocracy. Whatever the motives, I still quoting, the sages of State's Italian desk spent 1961 predicting that the opening to the left would not come for years. Then, as the apertura gathered momentum, they produced an alternative argument that it was coming anyway and therefore did not require our blessing. The pervading attitude was that in no case should we encourage a development which would constitute a crushing blow to communism in Italy and throughout Europe. Rather, Nenni and his party must meet a series of purity tests before they could qualify for American approval. I visited Rome again in February '62. I had then a long talk with Nenni at Tullio Zevi's house. I pressed him on the implications of the apertura for foreign affairs. Nenni emphasized his dislike of the communists, his support for the common market, and his acceptance of NATO on a de facto basis. His party's traditional neutralism, he said, meant the preservation of the existing European equilibrium, since Italian withdrawal from NATO would disrupt that equilibrium. Withdrawal, he argued, with a certain Jesuitical relish, would constitute an unneutral act, so the PSI was definitely against it. But in May '62, there were still those in the State Department who argued that the Nenni socialists were not anti-communist and that their success would strengthen anti-NATO sentiment in Italy. The absorption of the top people in high-priority items permitted mid-level officials to continue their obstruction, which they did with impressive assiduity. As I wrote in 1,000 Days, it was an endless struggle. Meetings would be called, decisions reached, cables sent. Then the next meeting would begin with the same old arguments. One felt entrapped as in a Kafka novel. In October '62, 16 months after Kennedy's talk with Fanfani, I sent an exasperated memorandum to Bundy. It began, as you will recall, the White House has been engaged for about 50 years in an effort to persuade the Department of State that an air of sympathy toward the Nenni socialists would advance the interests of the United States and of Western democracy. During this period, practically all the evidence has supported our view that the Nenni socialists have split irrevocably from the communists and are determined to bring their party into the democratic orbit. During this period, however, State at every step along the way has resisted proposals to hasten the integration of the socialists into the democratic camp. 6 weeks later, State came up with a new and even more far-fetched theory that if the socialists entered the Italian government, the Russians might take it as evidence of U.S. weakness and miscalculate the West's determination, as if Khrushchev based his assessment of American will on the composition of the government in Rome. By this time, the possibility was arising that if the opponents of the apertura succeeded, This might encourage the Demo-Christians to move right rather than left in broadening the government's base and bring into power a right-wing government with neo-fascist support, like the disastrous Tambroni government of 1960. In January 1963, Bob Comer and I sent Kennedy a memorandum recalling his Italian directives, describing our frustrations and concluding, "Lest you think you run the United States government, the matter is still under debate." However, our campaign was not altogether in vain. The center-left enthusiasts in Rome appreciated our efforts and discounted foot-dragging in foreign offices. In February 1963, Anthony Sampson reported to the London Observer from Rome, "Nenni, the old firebrand socialist, cannot now contain his praise for Kennedy. There is hardly a word in Rome of anti-Americanism except on the far right." In April, Harriman, who had been Assistant Secretary for the Far East, returned to European affairs, now as Undersecretary for Political Affairs. The old crocodile, as he was known in the department, was skilled and definitive in the uses of power and rapidly brought the bureaucracy under control. In July '63, when Kennedy himself visited Rome, he took Nenni aside at a garden party at the Quirinale Palace and engaged him in a conspicuously long conversation. Opposition to the center-left now vanished in Washington. November '63, the Nenni socialists entered the government. The center-left had finally prevailed. If only one could say that the center-left victory fulfilled our hopes of 30 years ago. But the failure of the center-left to regenerate Italian politics, to purify the administration of government, to produce economic and social reforms, and to realize Gaetano Salvini's dream of progressive Italian democracy is another story, one that many at this conference are far more competent than I am to tell. As a lover of Italy, I am still waiting and still hoping. Thank you.
Our next commentator is Mr. George Lister. Since Professor Schlesinger has already provided a very detailed and eloquent account of Mr. Lister's distinguished career in the State Department, I will simply indicate at this point that his present position is that of Senior Policy Advisor for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Mr. Lister. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. I thought that presentation was vintage Schlesinger. It was very good to hear directly from the man who played the leading role in changing Washington policy regarding the Italian center-left. I was particularly fascinated by Arthur's account of how he became involved in Italian affairs. Those of us who love Italy and are concerned with its past, present, and future are very glad indeed that he did become involved. I wish that I had known Koestler. His books influenced me greatly in my youth. And as I read the opening pages of Arthur's remarks to us this morning, I recalled once again what I consider to be one of the best observations by Karl Marx: we are all accidents of history. That's the way I see myself and everyone else. So I suppose it was only natural that Arthur Schlesinger's account would cause me to reflect on how I became involved with Italy. Many, many years ago, I was an undergraduate at CCNY, where Arthur now presides at the graduate school. Growing up on the sidewalks of New York, I went to CCNY because it was free, and I attended the evening session because during the day I was working full-time as a bank teller. CCNY was then one of the more radical colleges in this country. Every night you could find 3 groups of students arguing and debating in the basement: the socialists, the Stalinists, and the Trotskyites. I did not have much time, but occasionally I would ask questions, moving from one group to another. Looking back on my life, you might say that this was Operation Head Start. After 7 years of night school, I received my degree. Soon after passing the Foreign Service exams and joining the Career Diplomatic Service, I was assigned to Warsaw as third secretary. Poland was a great university for me. Under the Soviet-imposed dictatorship there, practically everyone was strongly anti-communist, including most of the government people I met. And Poland was the most pro-American country I have ever known, more pro-American than the US. Poles saw themselves caught as between Germany and Russia, while we were protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Talk about accidents of history. There was a Polish joke that God watches out for little babies, drunks, and the United States of America. Another Polish joke explained the difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and socialism is vice versa. I left Warsaw feeling that if there ever was a collapse of the Soviet Empire, it would start in Poland. I was right on that one. After Poland, I attended a year of Russian language training in Columbia University, then served 2 years in Moscow, followed by 4 years on the Polish desk back in Washington. By that time, I was requesting an assignment in the free world, preferably in a country with a large communist party. I was very lucky to be sent to Rome as first secretary, and that is how I became involved in Italy. As Arthur has already said, when I arrived in Rome in late 1957, our embassy shunned contact with the PSI. I had expressed a special interest in covering the Italian left, and I proposed that I talk with the socialists, along with the left of center Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Republicans, of course. Among other things, I pointed out that the combined communist-socialist vote was growing, and that it might soon begin to approach a majority. I also said I was sure the communists did not want us to develop a dialogue with the socialists. My request was granted. So in February 1958, I called Riccardo Lombardi to seek an appointment. We met for coffee at the Parliament, where Lombardi was a deputy. After some polite exchanges, Lombardi asked whether my visit reflected a change in US policy. I replied that I had just arrived in Rome and was trying to meet as many Italians as possible. Many years later, following his death, friends of Lombardi told me that at the time of this first encounter, he had suspected that I was with CIA. I was not and never have been. In any event, our friendship flourished, and we had many conversations which I carefully reported to Washington. Then my relations with the PSI expanded rapidly, although, of course, not all socialists were responsive. Two of my main contacts were Paolo Vittorelli and Giovanni Pieracini. I debated day and night with my new socialist friends, arguing that if they were sincere about helping Italian democracy and the working class, they should distance themselves from the Communist Party and enter the democratic area of Italian politics. I promised that by so doing, they would greatly influence State Department policy and contribute significantly to the development of Italian democracy. Fortunately, my wife Alita and I, along with my mother, had a conveniently located apartment in Rome, and it soon came to be an open house for advocates of the center-left. There was very encouraging progress in socialist public statements and actions. I even began to receive phone calls, sometimes late at night, from Nenni's colleagues, asking my opinion as to public statements they were thinking of recommending for him. Of course, they did not automatically accept my views. Occasionally, it was suggested that I should meet with Nenni. I would have welcomed that, but I was under embassy orders not to do so, and so I politely declined. Frankly, one of the greatest surprises in my relations with the Nenni socialists was their ignorance of the United States. I did not know one PSI leader who had been here, and some of their questions about this country were startling. Let me give you an example. At one point, I felt the progress in our relations was so encouraging that it would be useful to invite a leading socialist for a visit to the US as a guest of our government. I suggested Vittorelli. That was no problem for our embassy or the department, and Paolo was certainly enthusiastic. But the day after I invited him, he returned to my office rather nervously concerned and said that Nenni had ruled he could go to the U.S. only on two conditions. First, that if he were invited to speak in the U.S., he could accept. And two, that if he wanted to criticize the U.S. upon his return to Italy, he could do so. I stared at Vitorelli for a moment and then replied that both conditions were fine with us, and that if he would like reliable details about some of the problems and defects in U.S. daily life, I would be glad to supply them before his departure. Vitorelli thought his visit to the U.S. was a great success, and so did I. Then we invited more socialists, and they came without negotiating prior conditions. Of course, as many of you know, these were difficult times in Italian domestic politics. I will never forget one afternoon during the Tambroni government of 1960 when the Christian Democrats were dependent on MSI support in Parliament. The communists were hoping to split Italy between the right and the left, with the conservatives, neo-fascists, and the U.S. on one side, and the democratic left, the socialists, and the communists, supported by the USSR, on the other. On this occasion, the communists had organized a massive rally against the government, and they slowly moved forward toward the police lines, singing and shouting. Suddenly there were shots, and the police cars charged. The demonstrators fled, but after an instant of panic, I thought it best just to stand alone in the street. As the police came hurtling past, I could see that what had sounded like shots was the police banging their sticks on the sides of their cars. There were fights and arrests and blood, of course, but I was lucky and walked away unharmed. Those were exciting days. As Arthur has indicated, this was also a hard time in the embassy, and sometimes I felt very isolated. But it helped to know that there was some support back in Washington. One of the most dependable Washington advocates of the center-left in those days is here with us today, Dorothy Zering, along with her husband, Joe Zering. Dorothy was on the research side of CIA and an articulate proponent of dialogue with the socialists. When my 4-year tour of duty in Rome ran out, I was transferred back to the department, where I soon met Arthur Schlesinger, a major step forward for me. Once Averell Harriman had saved me from being selected out, it was possible to cooperate with Arthur, even though I was no longer officially involved with Italian affairs. We were in close contact. My Italian center-left friends kept coming to Washington. I would take them over to the White House to meet Schlesinger, and the dialogue flourished. Arthur continued to play the key role in Washington. Kennedy talked with Nenni in July 1963, and in November 1963, the socialists entered the government, in large measure thanks to the efforts of Arthur Schlesinger. Are there any lessons to be learned from all of this? Well, before I try to answer that, let me tell you very briefly of a sequel to my Italian experience. Soon after returning to the department, I was assigned to Latin American affairs, where I had begun my career. One of the first countries that caught my attention was Chile, where the Socialist Party was in close alliance with the communists, and once again, there was no socialist contact with us. I urged that we initiate a dialogue with the socialists, but to no avail. Eduardo Frei of the Christian Democrats was elected president in 1964, and the communists and socialists remained in opposition. Then in 1970, Salvador Allende won a fair election, and the socialists and communists came to power. In 1973, Allende was overthrown by a military coup, and thousands of Chilean refugees descended on the United States. I was soon immersed in the Chilean exile community, including socialists of various viewpoints. Meanwhile, we were making progress in the department in recommending a higher priority for human rights in our foreign policy, and our Human Rights Bureau was created. The human rights issue was a major factor in our support for Chilean democracy, while distancing ourselves from the Pinochet dictatorship and improving our relations and dialogue with the Chilean democratic opposition. I was convinced that there would be no transition to democracy in Chile without the cooperation of the democratic wing of the Socialist Party. And I pushed my Chilean socialist friends hard, urging them to reject Leninism and to take an honest and consistent position in favor of democracy and human rights in their visits to the State Department. When they did that, it had a very favorable impact, not only in Chile, but also in the U.S. Chile returned to democratic rule in 1989, and the socialists are now in the government. The stories of Italy and Chile are far from identical, but the similarities are startling. Could the Chilean tragedy have been avoided if there had been a dialogue with the socialists? What would have happened in Italy if there had been no dialogue with the socialists? We will never know. But I think that both the Italian and Chilean stories call attention to the importance of dialogue and distinguishing between the democratic and anti-democratic left. I emphasized both of those themes during my visit to Santiago, Chile, as a guest of the Chilean government, and certainly both themes are relevant here today. Well, with those comments and in that perspective, perhaps it is best for me to simply conclude by saying that considering everything, including what might have happened in Italy 30 years ago, we were all very lucky to have had Arthur Schlesinger in Washington as the defender of Italian democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lister. If there are any questions or comments from the audience, we would welcome them at this point.
It absolutely amazed me that there was an atmosphere outside Harvard that actually put Salvemini close to a devilish influence on students. Well, this is one aspect that I want to bring out, and completely detached from this another question, and that is in the presentations of Mr. Schlesinger and Mr. Lister, I missed completely the argument that was so close to our own idea of democracy. Wasn't it really an essential aspect of fostering democracy in Italy to help the socialists forward? Because that would be the only chance in Italy of having a true two-party government, as developed so very well in Germany in the post-war period between the CDU and the German Social Democrats. Did that argument ever occur in the State Department or in the discussions with the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations?
Would either Professor Schlesinger or Mr. Lister like to address that question?
The argument, I take it you mean that more than simply lifting the veto on the opening to the left, there should have been positive support given to the PSI.
Yes,
I think that was somewhat in our minds. The general belief was that Italy needed political, social, and economic reforms, that a center-left government would be more likely to do that, so that strengthening the socialist weight in such a government would increase the likelihood that such reforms would take place. The CIA, I guess, in that period was still making subventions to Italian political parties, but the main aid, I think, came from the labor movement, American labor movement, and that went, I do not know how, I cannot now remember how that was divided between the socialist and Christian trade unions on the one hand and the Socialist Party on the other. But that consideration was present in our minds. George may have some reflections on this.
No, I think my comment would be very brief. There was discussion from time to time in the embassy and in the department, the possibility of another government coming into power without the Christian Democrats, but there was quite naturally a feeling that the socialists, at least a significant portion of them, were still close to the communists, and that we might have a socialist communist government coming in as an alternative to the Christian Democrats. There was a misunderstanding and failure all around, including in the PSI, of the importance of distinguishing between the democratic left and the anti-democratic left, and equally important, the importance of dialogue. Reading some of the headlines in Avanti, some of the statements by PSI leaders, it was easy for opponents of the center-left frequently to rationalize their position. The dialogue was desperately needed. Once we had that going, it worked out.
Any other questions?
I was much impressed by the point in the talk of Professor Schlesinger about, if I understood, it was aware of that, was approved. This is a little bit more. You can comment and start with it.
Well, I took this from the authoritative work on this subject by Spencer de Scala, who took part of it from Alan Platt's unpublished PhD thesis. I will let Spencer answer that question. Was the Secretary of State aware of anything?
I doubt it. I don't. To answer that specific question, I don't think so. When I was doing the research, I, of course, ran into the problem of getting all kinds of interviews and stories. On the one hand, I spoke to Professor Tamburano. On the other hand, I spoke to about this possibility. I spoke to Giovanni Pieraccini. They had opposite views, and what I tried to do was to summarize everything. This is a famous CFAR case, as you know. I tried to summarize the different views, and I didn't really come to a conclusion. But I thought there was something. I thought that there had to be something in Italy. Now, I know that Vernon Walters was very close to De Lorenzo. He states this in his memoirs, Silent Missions, and in fact, if you read those memoirs, you see that they were extremely close. I tried to interview Vernon Walters about this, but he didn't want to speak to me. I draw no conclusions from that, being a good civil libertarian. But that I summarized the conclusion in the book, which, or the different sides is what I do in the book. As you know, there's a report of the Italian Parliament, both the majority and several minority reports, which also summarize all these things and bring everything together. Now, there's one sequel to this, and that is in, I guess, 1991 now. I traveled to the Johnson Library, which at the time I traveled to the Johnson Library in Austin, which at the time that I wrote my book, the documents were unavailable. They were they were not processed and so on and so forth. And when I went there, I discovered a telegram which was sent from the American Armed Forces in Verona, went to headquarters in Heidelberg, and then subsequently was distributed in Washington. This telegram, which was, I think, July of 1964, about the time of the CFAR, supposed CFAR coup attempt or idea, this telegram by the Americans laid everything out. That is, all of the CFAR plot, which you will find alleged in the documents that I mentioned to you of the Parliament. The American Armed Forces knew everything, because it's just laid out. I could give you a copy of this telegram if you want. It was published in Italian in L'Espresso. After that time, during my research there, I did subsequent research, which showed that various people, this was a period of crisis at this time, with the Colombo there and so on. And at this time, various people went to Washington. One was Walt Rostow, who I was not able to get in touch with at the time that I looked at these things. Another one was Arthur Schlesinger. And there are various memos, which are not really, don't say anything about CFAR or whatever, but they do refer to Italians being very nervous about a possible plot and being extremely nervous about this, this possible development and about the economic situation. And Rostow then went to Germany and put pressure on the Germans to give the Italians economic aid, came back to Washington and did the same thing. And then within a few days, Guido Carli was in Washington, in which an aid package was worked out. As you know, one of the things surrounding the whole question of the CFAR plot was this question of fuga dei capitali, of the economic problem and so on and so forth. So that was one aspect of it, and that was healed somehow by, this time, the Johnson administration. So I don't know what the situation is at that time, whether I think there was definitely a plot. I don't know whether then the plotters spoke to, this is 64, whether the plotters informed the American Armed Forces, as probably they would have had to do if they had planned this, and the armed forces obviously informed the American authorities, and then the Americans then intervened in order to stop it, or what happened. But there are these circumstances which are still rather clouded as far as that issue is concerned. And this obviously goes back to the Vernon Walters issue, which Arthur Schlesinger mentioned. And here, there are also other kinds of strange coincidences. One that's always pointed out, I haven't pointed out, and I'm not alleging anything, but soon after this time, Vernon Walters became ambassador to Brazil. And soon after he was ambassador to Brazil, there was a coup d'etat in Brazil. And there is a book, which I could give you a reference to, called In Malafare, I think, in which an Italian scholar who did research in this library alleges that there was this plot. But I guess all the facts are as yet unknown. But there are these, this context and its frame, which is certainly very suspicious.
May I add a brief word on Vernon Walters, whom I had first known in 1948 when Averell Harriman was setting up the Marshall Plan in Europe, and I was working with Harriman, and Vernon Walters was Harriman's interpreter. And when Harriman went from country to country around Europe to negotiate the terms and conditions under which the Marshall Plan was to operate in these countries, I was terribly impressed, by the way, to whatever country we went to, Walters could speak with total fluency the language of the country. He was a marvelous linguist. But other contacts with him in the course of that trip persuaded me that he was an idiot savant, who was a great linguist, but his political views were extreme right-wing views. Later in his book, Secret Missions, he has an account of taking me in 1962 or 63 on a visit to President Segni, in which he claims that I asked President Segni for his assessments of various Italian political figures, that Segni was reluctant, thinking this not a proper thing to do, reluctant to respond to this improper request, that I said, insistently that President Kennedy had wanted me to do this, and that he could be assured that anything he told me would be for President Kennedy only. So with great reluctance, Segni, according to Vernon Walters, gave me his judgments about leading Italian political figures. And then, according to Walters, I returned to the United States, published Segni's reflections, assessments in the article. Segni, this caused a scandal in Italy. Segni had a stroke as a result and died. This whole thing is total fantasy. There is no such article. I wrote to Walters and extracted from him an apology and a promise to delete the story in a subsequent printing of the book, of which there was none. But Walters is a raconteur who embellishes his stories as he tells them. Secret Missions is a quite unreliable book, and I would find his testimony on anything very doubtful. The one consistent thing about him is very strong proto-fascist political views.
Yes, sir. A little louder, sir. We can't hear you.
You could translate for him as Italian.
I'm sorry, we didn't hear the question.
Ask him to do it in Italian, translate it for him.
What is that?
Più forte.
Puoi dirlo in italiano, poi traduciamo.
Solo un giudizio, come uno degli storici del centro-sinistra, vorrei confermare quello che avete detto tu e Mr.
Was that as a historian, he wants to confirm what both of us have said about the center-left. Professor Tamburano wrote a well-regarded book on the center-left.
Joel?
Two questions, if I might. One from my own research. I have the sense that at least in the years from 1925 to 33, that Salvemini was more active in anti-fascist activities, not only in the States, certainly that would be true for the period after 33, but in Europe. And I'd like to ask if that's the sense of the panelists, the degree of Salvemini's activity in the anti-fascist campaign.
I think that I've gone through documents and I've seen certainly a lot of activity of Salvemini. He was constantly going from Britain to France, and also when he came to the United States in various boat trips, which must have been very difficult, and taking the train and going all over and so on. But I do get the impression that he was extremely actively involved with Giustizia e Libertà, and he was constantly going back and forth in their telegrams from various Italian officials following his every step. Salvemini arrived today at so on and so forth, and met with somebody or other. And I get this idea that there certainly was an extreme amount of activity there. What it was, I don't know.
As for the second question, what did we think of the socialists? Our feeling was that Italy had been for some time in a state of immobilism. There was, as we were saying in the United States, time to get the country moving again. That there was a need for social reform, structural reforms of various sorts, and that the socialists would strengthen any. The Demo-Christians were in their usual state of confusion with many wings and no strong reform impulse. And it was our hope that the socialist entry into the government would make possible the kinds of economic reforms and so on that would improve the social conditions of Italy and, among other things, reduce the audience for the communists. We also hoped, ironically, that this would improve the honesty of public administration in Italy. But George Lister might have further views on this.
No, I agree with what you just said, Arthur. Once again, I don't want to sound monotonous, but there was some prejudice against the PSI on the part of the United States. There was some prejudice on the part of the PSI against the United States. There were, of course, without sounding hysterical about it, there were, of course, communist agents inside the PSI who simply followed the communist directive. Some of them were quite articulate at socialist meetings. So there was no guarantee one way or the other as to how things were going to come out. And there are a lot of unpleasant surprises in life. Once again, what was so obviously needed was for the American government and the PSI to get to know each other, warts and all. There were a lot of defects on the side of the PSI. There were a lot of defects inside the United States government. If the two had come to know each other much earlier, and intelligent, well-meaning people on both sides could start cooperating, we could have saved a lot of time. As it was, I think we were lucky to come out the way we did.
All right, we will break now for lunch. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Like one of these or no?
Yes, I will. I thought it was very interesting. George, you were very generous.
Thought that went very well.
That was a beautiful statement.
Thank you.